Prohibition in the 1920s. You may be wondering, what is prohibition? Well, here's a simple definition for you. Prohibition is the legal prevention of the manufacture, sale, and the transportation of alcoholic beverages.
Now, before we talk about how Prohibition affected the 1920s, we must talk about its backstory and educate you about how Prohibition started and why it started. Back in the 19th century, the temperance movement was the idea that people were drinking way too much and needed to control their consumption of alcohol, such as whiskey, rum, or any hard alcohol. I like to think that there are three major causes for the temperance movement, which are, number 1, the Second Great Awakening, 2, the Industrial Revolution, and 3, growing nativism, where new immigrants were coming into America. The Second Great Awakening focused on social reforms around capturing moral good or Christian ideals within society. It enforced the idea that people needed to be better versions of themselves, and social institutions like schools, prisons, etc. should reflect this idea and teach it to people. Alcohol was destroying families, institutions, and workplaces. In addition, husbands were spending all their family income on alcohol, so adding a law that would restrict people from drinking alcoholic beverages seemed like a great idea. The Industrial Revolution was on the rise during the 19th century, so if people were drinking alcohol on the job, the likelihood of them getting injured increased like crazy, potentially risking their life. Now, if you look at the picture on the left here, what's interesting about this photo is how they are replacing beer with tea, which served like as a coping mechanism. Growing nativism. Catholic immigrants who drank a lot were immigrating into the country, and Protestants already living in the country were against them. The Protestants would go around their community and spread all these racial comments about the Catholics. Eventually, the Catholics aligned themselves with the Democratic Party, while the Protestants aligned themselves with the Whig Party. And eventually, the temperance movement was more of like a political movement. Now, people were concerned about alcohol intoxication and needed to take action quickly. Lyman Beecher is the man who took a stand against this issue. It was in 1825 that he did his 6 sermons on the sins of alcohol, which established this idea in the American mind that it was anti-Christian to drink alcohol. This eventually became a national movement, with the first National Temperance Society established in 1826, known as the American Temperance Society. The South and the West were pleased with this law, as this prevented American Africans from consuming alcohol, which would cause unwanted outbursts. Now, fast forward to 1917, after the United States entered World War I, President Woodrow Wilson instituted a temporary wartime prohibition in order to save grain for producing food. That same year, Congress submitted the 18th Amendment, which banned the manufacture, transportation, and sale of intoxicating liquors for state ratification. Congress had imagined the amendment would take over 7 years to be appealed. However, in just 11 months, they had received enough support necessary to put it into effect. The 18th Amendment was ratified on January 16, 1919, and went into effect a year later. In October 1919, Congress put forth the National Prohibition Act, which provided guidelines for the federal enforcement of prohibition, more commonly known as the Volstead Act. Now, this Volstead Act, or the National Prohibition of Alcohol, the noble experiment, was undertaken to reduce crime and corruption, solve social problems, reduce tax burden created by prisons and poorhouses, and improve health and hygiene in America. However, this is ironic because it had the opposite effect. Alcohol became more dangerous to people as they were making their own gin. Crime increased and became organized. Courts and prisons were at its breaking point. There was lots of corruption. There was no progress in this decision. Prohibition removed a significant source of tax revenue, which increased government spending, and led many drinkers to switch to harder drugs such as opium, marijuana, patent medicines, cocaine, and other dangerous substances if it was not for Prohibition.
How Prohibition shaped the 1920s. The rise of speakeasies. Speakeasies were hidden sections of an establishment that were used to illegally sell alcoholic beverages during the Prohibition. They were everywhere, especially in large cities. However, they were very difficult to find. To enter any speakeasy, a secret password whispered to the doorman was required. This was needed to keep this place secretive and hidden. A fun fact about speakeasies is blind tiger or blind pig are a few other names for a speakeasy. These were hidden names made to disguise hidden bars and evade the Prohibition laws. Bootlegging. Now, you can't talk about the 1920s without talking about bootlegging. Bootlegging was the legal manufacture, transportation, distribution, or sale of alcoholic beverages. For many, bootlegging was a huge opportunity to make a lot of money through illegally selling alcohol. The earliest bootleggers smuggled alcohol from various places such as Cuba, the Bahamas, Mexico, Canada, and many other places. Other bootleggers got doctors' prescriptions for medicinal whiskey, and some bootleggers made their own alcohol concoctions which they sold. This was usually done in the night to avoid detection, and the alcohol was watered down normally in bathtubs. Hence the rise of the terms moonshine and bathtub gin. Organized crime. Speakeasies were usually revolved around organized crimes and gangs. Gangs involved in the speakeasy business gained vast wealth during the Prohibition because there were many people who felt the need to indulge in the alcoholic beverages. They received big money for hustling liquor and gained a lot of influence over speakeasies. Organized crime, speakeasies, and bootlegging always went hand in hand because their businesses and roles were always intertwined with each other. Two of the biggest criminals in the businesses are Al Capone and George Remus. Al Capone is an iconic figure of a successful American gangster who ran an organized crime syndicate in Chicago during the 1920s and started bootlegging in Chicago. And George Remus is known as the king of bootleggers. These two criminal figures were important factors to the development of the 1920s and were part of the people who ran underground America during these times. Rise of temperance groups. The Ku Klux Klan, one of the major supporters of Prohibition, was the second KKK, often known as the KKK of the 1920s. The Methodist Episcopal Church Board of Temperance, Prohibition, and Public Morals, a powerful force in the temperance movement. They enforced Prohibition and attempted to get rid of any criticism it faced. They also advocated a mandatory 5-year imprisonment for anyone who purchased a pint or more of bootleg alcohol. These are only a few examples of temperance movements that were active during the Prohibition in the 1920s.
The connection to the Great Gatsby. Prohibition created a new money class. The US government enforced prohibition in the early 1920s, but this did not stop people from drinking. Instead, speakeasies were established. People started making their own liquor to fuel their crazy parties, where people did not care what was happening around them or what can potentially happen to them, also known as fatalism, and generated a lot of wealth in the process in a short amount of time, like Gatsby.
Now, we all know that Gatsby generated his wealth by bootlegging alcohol because of how Tom Buchanan exposed them in Chapter 7. Tom said he and this Wolfgang brought up a lot of side street drugstores here and in Chicago and sold green alcohol over the counter. That's one of his little stunts. I picked him for a bootlegger the first time I saw him, and I wasn't far off.
Now, what's truly interesting is that despite Gatsby having all that wealth, he was at his happiest when he was with Daisy. It shows that the love for money does not bring happiness or fill that empty void in one's heart. What truly brings happiness is spending time with the people who we love most. Thanks for listening to
Thanks
our
for
presentation.
listening to our presentation.
But yeah. And here's our We're Excited page with all our links. Yeah.
All right, nice.